Audrey Van Dyke, welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast.
Morning, Sean.
I'm glad to have you come on today. For our guest here, Audrey Van Dyke, she served in a variety of environmental health and safety and energy positions, primarily in the industry, but also as a consultant and working in the state and federal governments. During her 30-year career, she has been leading in the shift for organizations to move from compliance to EHS and improvements to operational excellence and sustainability. And Audrey, thanks for joining us. Really excited to have you on and to talk about environmental management systems.
Well, I'm glad to do it, Sean. That's one of my favorite topics.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. It's good. Well, okay. So, let's give the listeners a little bit more about what you've been up to, and you spent a good part of your career in the private sector. Talk a little bit about your past experience with your previous career, and then how you got to where you are today.
Well, I guess after grad school, I was in the Washington, D.C. area, and all the jobs were with either the government pretty much or government contractors. And I knew I wanted something different. And back then in civil and environmental engineering, they didn't really talk to you about careers in manufacturing. But I went to the Midwest, and the Midwest being a big manufacturing hub,
Right.
really opened up a lot of opportunities. And that's where I moved over to and pretty much stayed most of my career, 25 plus years on the manufacturing side. I think now they do a better job career-wise of educating students on those opportunities, especially with STEM programs and those kind of things.
Oh, okay. Well, so you spent some time, I believe, with CNH, right? You were quite involved in their environmental organization.
Yes, I was at CNH in the environmental health, safety, and energy manager role for most recently prior to starting my own company.
Well, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that transition. You went from being in the working for private industry for quite a while, and then you moved into your own consulting business, and you started that just a couple years ago, I believe, and now you're also a certified women business enterprise company. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the benefits of obtaining that certification.
Yeah, my business is certified by the Women's Business Enterprise National Council. They're the largest group that certifies women-owned businesses. There are a couple others. They are sponsored by a number of corporations who have part of their goal to increase the diversity of their supply chain.
Right.
So through that, they offer not only the certification part, but they also have a lot of mentoring, a lot of training, a lot of networking opportunities with other women-owned businesses and also with those corporate sponsors. So there's a lot of one-on-one type events, matchmaking events that the group holds that are pretty helpful.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it's good to see that there's an organization supporting you guys and providing some resources and probably some networking capability. That's great. And has that parlayed into some new opportunities for you?
It has opened up some discussions with potential clients, and probably more importantly, just networking with other women-owned businesses, and some contacts have spun off of that. So small consulting, it's all about your network. So any opportunities to network with like-minded companies and other businesses is beneficial.
Right, exactly. Well, so let's get into the meat of our conversation today. Can you give our listeners a brief overview of the different types of ISO management systems, and maybe just kind of touch on what is ISO, that standard, and let's dig into the various different systems that are out there that you work on.
So ISO is the International Standards Organization. They develop and publish standards on a variety of things. What we're going to be looking at today is a small corner of what they do. We'll look environmental, safety, energy, and then there's other organizations that do similar type standards for water, electronics recycling, pretty much any aspect of business. There's probably a standard out there for.
Right.
But ISO has been around the longest and is really considered probably one of the most credible certifications to go after. The most common that a lot of people will know is for quality, the ISO 9001. A lot of companies do that to show that they're meeting their customer requirements for whatever it is they're producing.
Sure.
But they're all the same, regardless of the discipline they're in. They follow a plan, do, check, act cycle. It just, the steps within each of those for tasks varies, obviously, depending on the subject matter. So plan what you're going to do what you said you were going to do, check that it's working the way you set it up to do, and it's getting the results that you expected, and then do further improvement in the final stage.
So it sounds like there's always kind of that perpetual continual improvement process, typically, if you're really operating your system well.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the environmental standard, the ISO 14001 standard.
So ISO 14001 was recently updated in 2015, and companies are now just upgrading to that new standard. And really can talk probably about the safety and energy ones at the same time, because they're all very, very similar in structure. So in the planning phase, you're looking at figuring out what your issues are, what internal and external issues you have that are important that need to be addressed. Who are the relevant stakeholders, your interested parties? What are your legal requirements?
Right.
What are other requirements that your organization might subscribe to? Do you have sustainability goals? Do you have industry associations that you've signed up for some kind of commitments? You're really looking to figure out what all your requirements
are.
And then from there, you set up objectives and targets and controls for ensuring that you're going to meet all those many requirements. Then in the checking, you're looking to monitor and measure. So what do you need to track to make sure you're meeting all those requirements? How frequently do you need to track it? What kind of data are you going to generate, and what are you going to do with the data that you find? How do you know what those results mean, and how do you know when you've met the target that you set?
So we've got the environmental the ISO 14001. That's kind of the EMS standard for the most part, and then that's going to help a company really vet out all of their environmental requirements, as they're required to follow their permit obligations, their safety. Well, you've got the 18,000, that's more safety, but there's other requirements that in the environmental one that that's going to be important to keep track of. If we dive into the safety one, that one did a recent update too. So it's no longer the 18,000 one. Now it's the ISO 45,001, right?
That's correct. So that was a big change for the standard one. It brought it in a line to follow the same structure as the rest of the ISO standards. Previously, OSAS was a British standard. But the other two things that were key when they issued the new standard were, one is that it now requires worker consultation and participation. And that's when you hear that, you think, oh, well, we involve our workers. But if you look at the standard, the definition of participation is that your workers are involved in decision making. And then consultation is that you are seeking their views before you make a decision. That sounds a lot harder than
that sounds like herding the cats.
Employees are involved in a safety committee, and
that sounds like herding cats now, right? So
So
that sounds like a lot more input that's going to be involved with, establishing the requirements and the program objectives in the 45,001 new version. So,
yeah, the
um,
standard actually sets out a number of specific places where that workers need to be either involved or participating. And so you really have to become intentional about how you're involving them to make sure that you
mhm.
can meet the requirements of the standard. Having a safety committee is not really enough anymore.
Oh,
You need, there's other points in your safety management that trigger these requirements. And so you have to plan for that and make sure that you're doing them.
okay. So that's two of them. Let's see. We have another one here probably to touch on the energy, the ISO 50001 standard. And looks like there was a new update back in 2018 on that one. So let's talk about that one a little bit. Give the listeners an idea of what that's involved. What does that cover?
Well, the energy standard is all about energy performance improvement. If I was to start as an organization with any of the standards, I might do this one first because
Really?
saving and reducing energy saves money. So it gives
Right.
the standard a more positive feel right up front. Health and safety and environment ultimately will save you money, but originally or initially, a lot of it is about reducing risk. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
that's sometimes not so tangible to see on the bottom line, but saving energy is. Uh,
They're saving money so they can see the dollar signs here a little easier, right?
and with that, it's a pretty straightforward standard because you're looking at it's again all about performance. So you're always checking to see that you're reducing energy consumption.
So
It's
how?
similar in environmental. You're looking at your significant environmental aspects. In the
Uh-huh.
safety standard, you're looking at your hazards and risks. And in energy, you're looking at your significant energy use. So ISO doesn't tell you how to figure out what those are. It's up to each organization to come up with a method to identify those. So you have still a lot of freedom, even though there is a overriding standard that sets the structure for the
It's
program.
going to give you those guidelines, but you have the flexibility to kind of craft and create the program to fit your business.
Yes.
No, that's good. Okay, I like that. And then there's the ISO 9001 or the ISO 9000 standard. So you talk about some linkages between EHSE and E standards in that one because there's always a process procedure, some sort of a review, some sort of a filing system, a verification process, right? I mean, basically confirming that you've got good quality in everything you're providing as a service or as a management tool, right?
Right. So as they've been upgrading all the standards and with safety when they issued the new one, they're all following the same high level structure. So they all have the same 10 clauses. And so there's a lot of opportunity to link the different standards together. So it
Mhm.
could be on how you manage documents. It could be how you manage corrective actions and nonconformances. It could be your management review. It
Mhm.
could be the auditing function. You could
Mhm.
do common audits within your facility. So that it does, with the structure being more similar, it makes it easier to align the different systems.
Okay. And then there's a couple other standards I think that are kind of associated here with the various ones that we've been talking about. But one's electronic recycling and responsible recycling standard, the R2 2013 standard. And then the last one is the water, AWS water stewardship standard. So, I mean, talk about those and how they fit into the overall standard, picture here.
Well, the electronics recycling has a really direct tie to ISO 14001 because it
Uh
actually
huh.
requires that you get ISO 14001.
Ah, okay.
On top of that, you also it's designed for companies, organizations that repair and recycle electronics.
Hmm.
So it's all about preventing the situations that I think was it on 60 Minutes or one of the news shows they followed a truckload of electronics that ended up going to China or somewhere overseas and weren't managed the way people thought they were going to be. So it requires transparency on what's happening to everything, what's being reconditioned and reused, what's being recycled, what has no, the standard intends that everything get recycled, but if there is something that has no further end use, where does it go?
Yeah, no market.
Companies in that industry have to track everything that goes in and goes out of their facility.
So is that standard really kind of one of those standards that a company really high on sustainability reporting and metrics in that space, they'll pretty much adopt this type of standard in their business so they can really get to the tracking component of that?
Well, it would be really just the facilities that do the recycling, but as a company that would generate used electronics, you would want to you'd want to send yours to somebody who had that certification. So that way you'd have
Oh, I see. Okay, so
that
the
it was
electronic
being properly
recycling
managed.
standard is for the processing facility, not the actual
Yep.
generating facility. Oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't catch that earlier. So, okay, all right. So that's kind of like maybe a designation when you're doing an audit of a final receiving processing facility. You ask them if they are, up to standard with this requirement.
That's correct.
I gotcha. Well, then, okay, so the water standards, the water stewardship standard 2.0, let's talk about that.
Water standard's a little newer. It's designed to, water's different than some of the other environmental issues because it can be much more local in impact. So if you do something related to water, it's not going to generally affect somebody on the other side of the world the way emissions, for example, could.
Sure.
So water, the focus of the standard is more local. It's intended that you understand your water use and the impacts that it has and work collaboratively with stakeholders and to make water improvements and to address water challenges that may exist in your catchment. And a catchment is similar to a watershed, but it's focused on the site that's getting certified. So it includes all the area upstream that would contribute water to the site and anything downstream that site could impact. So it could be an entire watershed, or it could be something a little bit smaller.
Okay. And so some water stewardship techniques that a company who may want to adopt this is just to, recycle stormwater as much as possible, or maybe change a process where they use less water, or, what?
It can be both. It can be process improvements, and then it can be also things outside the facility, rain gardens, and you mentioned stormwater improvements. Both would be activities that an organization could look at under the standard. It requires a water balance. So you have, again, similar to the ISO standard, there's a planning phase. You identify what
Water inputs and
coming
consumption.
in, whether that's rainfall, runoff, what comes in, products that you use, and then what goes out. Is there water in your product that you're producing? Where's your runoff go? Where's your wastewater go? So complete water balance.
Gotcha. Well, so if you were to look at these standards, what's the most difficult standard to really kind of implement? If you were a business, it's like, I kind of like this idea, but boy, which one's going to give them the most challenge?
I would say right now the one that's most challenging is probably just the newest one, because environmental, energy, 9000, electronics, they've been around for a while. There's lots of established tools for how to evaluate your environmental aspects, those different things. But health and safety, there's a lot of new requirements. How are you going to deal with the participation and consultation? What the communication tools that are required? How are you going to remove barriers to workers as a result of language, for example, that might prevent them from being able to participate? So there's a lot of new things that facilities might have not thought about before that could make that one the most challenging. A couple years from now, after, you know, there's lots of, it's like the other ones and it's well established, and that won't be the case. But I think right now, because it's new and it's a change.
I gotta imagine the certified safety professionals working in these organizations are just loving this standard right now. I mean, they're like, it's all about safety. I can contribute. I can talk. I can like get people to get on committees and talk safety and deal with outcomes and safety practices. I think they're probably loving this standard right now.
Yes, and it does place all the ISO standards require commitment of leadership if you're going to pursue the standards. So for organizations that do, that is always important in safety.
Sure. Well, so we've been talking about these standards, and I think there's still a little bit of some mystery here when we've been talking so far about, well, how do you go about setting something up? So let's try to break this down for the listeners a little bit and maybe get into what does a company do to go about developing the structural elements of one of these management systems?
Well, the standard walks you through it to a large extent. So you're going to go through clause by clause, and with a plan, do, check, act, you're going to start at the planning stage. And the planning stage is where a bulk of the requirements are. It's the majority of the clauses are included in planning. So you first step, you're going to decide the scope. What is it you're certifying? Is it one address? Is it just part of your process? Is it your whole facility? Do you maybe have down the street you want to include too? Multiple? Is it your whole region? Maybe you have multiple facilities. So you're going to sit down and look at a lot of basic questions. What is it that I'm certifying or looking to include? Then you're going to look at who are your interested parties. Is it employees, customers, the government, neighbors, who might that be, and what are their needs? Then you're going to look at issues internally and externally that you have that can affect your ability to have a successful management system. Is that regulatory? Is that utility prices? What are the things that are going to either help you or hinder you in being successful at your management system? And you're going to look at your legal requirements. And again, also other requirements, industry associations, sustainability targets. And you're going to put all those, so you're going to take all those things that you've looked at in that planning stage, and you're going to need to manage them through the rest of the system. So they're going to need, some of them you're going to determine are significant and need action plans. Boy, we've got this stakeholder out here, and they're really important, and we need to, respond to them. So we want to have a plan for how we're going to do that. So you put together different action plans for these issues. Or there's a new regulatory requirement coming down the road. Boy, we have to plan for that. It's going to mean we need a new permit, and we need a 6-month lead time. We got to make sure we got a plan in place to do that.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of one right now that's come off the top of my head. So tier 2 reporting is coming up, or is it TRI? I think. Anyways, the PFAS chemicals are now going to be added to the reporting list, and so I'm sure that people are going to go back and adjust their 14,001 EMS program to address that fact. If in fact there's reporting requirements that from the company.
Yes, and I'm working with some clients right now on that very issue. So they, in the ISO 14,001 and same for 45,001, you have a legal register. So you list all your requirements. So this is a new requirement, so it would need to go on the list, and you need to determine whether it's applicable to your operation. So you have to have a mechanism for searching through your chemical inventories to determine, do you have any PFAS? Using any.
And so, going through those legal registers, and let's talk about that a bit, because that's the EMS program. There's a lot there to identify, and so I'm sure when you're going through and establishing and trying to identify every single requirement, you really got to spend quite a bit of time if you're going to help a client develop this program for them, reviewing all their permits, making sure you understand everything that they need to do, whether it's air, waste, water, safety. Um, that's a lot of time commitment to go through and identify that. What do you think about that aspect of the commitment in the program?
Well, that makes the health and safety and environmental management systems different than, say, quality or energy, because there's
Mhm.
a big legal requirement that doesn't exist in those other two, and that can be significant.
Right.
Certainly,
Do you
all the
find
OSHA
clients?
requirements have to be listed in your legal register on the health and safety side, and then any state or local. Same for on the environmental. That legal register, depending on the industry that you're in, can be hundreds of items long.
Sure, right. I mean, so have you found that, some of the clients you may be working with, they're surprised. They're like, "Uh-oh, we didn't realize we had to do that, and we haven't been doing that."
There can be surprises, yes.
Oh, I can only imagine. Yeah, it's like, man. And so when this aspect of the program is done, then it really helps identify what needs to get done. And then they're at that point, they need to start figuring out who are they assigning the tasks and responsibilities to complete these obligations as part of the program. Is that right?
Right. So part of the standard is assigning roles and responsibilities for and that can include people, that can include budget, not just who's going to do it, but sometimes funding is needed.
Yeah. How's it going to get paid for? Or how am I going to contract it out, on certain aspects of the project or the requirements? Yeah. Um, So, there's a lot of written documentation with these standards when you really establish them. So that seems to be probably a hurdle for some of the companies to really kind of put this together.
It can be. There are now very specific places where the standard says you have to have documented information to
Hmm.
know how you're meeting a requirement of the standard. But if you walk through some of the requirements now, they are set up, there are a number of different bulleted items. A lot of them can be satisfied by a matrix table. You can write out your requirements that way. It doesn't necessarily have to be, a 10-page
Written report.
document. Some are going to be procedures, and you're going to have to write those out, but some can be simpler. It just, every organization has their own way they like to do documentation. Some have very complex systems. Some are
Yeah.
keep it simple. But the standard is very specific about what needs to be written down. So auditors who come in will be looking for all the places where it says this shall
You're
be
doing something. Yeah, you're
written
doing something
information
and
on
they
it.
want to verify it. Right. Absolutely. Well, so if you're a company and you're looking to implement one of these programs, and they're not familiar with, how to do it, what type of resources are available for them? I mean, obviously there's consulting companies like yourself who are available to support and you've got experience, but are there other tools for them to access?
There can be, depending on the standard. Some states on the energy management side have
Hmm.
offered up funding for companies as an incentive to do the ISO
Oh,
51,
okay.
particularly when the standard first came out, but there are still um, those incentives out there. I think even Canada, I was just reading, they are still pushing that standard, and so there are some financial incentives for implementing ISO 50001. They won't pay for the certification itself, but they will. The, the funding will help support what you have to do to implement it. So training and some of those costs that a company might have.
So some of the costs associated like with the energy one too, I'm thinking of retrofitting, lighting fixtures, from the incandescent lights to LEDs and things like that. Is there incentives to do those things to reduce your energy consumption?
That's really varies by utility
Okay.
and by state. So some states, like Wisconsin, has focus on energy, They have a lot of different rebates, standard rebates on things, lighting being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are also custom rebates if you have a proposal that they'll consider. Other utilities, usually lighting is a very common one that you can find rebates for, but some utilities don't have anything at all. So
Nothing, huh?
you really have to check. It's a local.
And is I'm assuming solar's part of the energy program, right?
Solar can be, but
Wind.
you're still consuming energy when you consume solar. So it is helpful from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint if that's something you have targets for and you're trying to reduce as part of your management system, but you're still using energy. And so the standard is looking to see that you reduce energy. So just switching all your energy consumption from electric utility to solar and you use the same amount, wouldn't necessarily get you energy performance improvement in the eyes of ISO 50001. It would get you definitely the greenhouse gas emission reductions.
Right. Some
But you
credits
have to
there.
look at energy efficiency and reducing your consumption in addition to how green the energy is.
Sure. Okay. Well, one of the key benefits of implementing one of these standards is the ability to measure the success of the program. And I got to imagine, that can be challenging for some companies who are maybe not used to the new standard, not used to the change of the process. How have you been able to help clients with the change management, approach, or the concept here of changing the way you do things to a new standard? Because I remember coming into consulting 18 years ago, and my company that I work for had the ISO 9001 standard. And I was surprised on how much, processes, procedures were involved with just doing a report and having somebody prove it and write off and things like that. That management change, I think, is probably pretty challenging. How do you help people overcome that?
Management of change is, for many, is the hardest part of the standard. Change can be hard.
Right.
Also, there's sometimes a perception that you're always looking for negative.
All right.
But you want to capture the positive changes as well. And many organizations, probably most, change is pretty constant. That's
Yeah.
so it's hard to stop and step back and say, hey, wait a minute, we got to take a look at this. We got to capture the benefits, or we've got to offset the impacts of what we're doing here. So there's a variety of different ways, but
Well, do you get like leadership together and try to coach them up on, the what they're about to encounter with this new system, and how to coach their employees to, embrace this new process? How does that work?
yes, that's part of it. And a lot of it is perception. Initially, some people will think management of change is, EHS wants to stop your project. And that's not what it is. It's just
Right.
evaluating it and making sure that everything's been considered. Like I said, it's many industries change is constant, so it is hard sometimes to keep up. The right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing because they're moving so quickly. So it's
Right.
you need to find those intersections where there's an opportunity for everyone to discuss, and you want to try to make sure that you're not adding redundancy, because that generally never works. If you're adding on lots of requirements, you want to integrate it with how the business already is working. So if you can make it part of the budget review or the capital approval process, somewhere where there's already that kind of activity going on, you're going to be more successful than if you add another layer onto
Right.
solidization.
Right. Well, so I got to imagine that the success of implementing these programs is really it's driven by the leadership within the company, right? I mean, in my view of this is that if the top management's not, behind this, middle management and the frontline leaders are, they're always maybe not following it like they need to, or pushing it out. What's your experience of trying to gain that support from top management?
Well, that's something that has to be talked about right at the front of
Mm-hmm.
the system, because you won't be successful if you do not
Mm-hmm.
have the leadership commitment right up front. Because now all the new standards have actually eliminated the role of the management rep. Leadership cannot delegate their leadership responsibility to someone else. They have to be the one that is demonstrating and setting the requirements for whether it's environmental, safety, energy, quality. They are the one person responsible for
Right.
that policy, that commitment, and demonstrating leadership. So the standards have really strengthened that requirement for top management, and they need to understand how important that role is.
Well, do you find yourself having one-on-one conversations with, the top management of the companies that you may be working with to, before you implement, you sit them down and say, hey, this is what this means, and this is what it's going to be expected if we roll this out. And are you prepared to do that?
Yeah, and talk to them about what are ways that you can demonstrate your commitment. For example, when you go out in the shop floor, do you have your PPE on? If you see someone who doesn't, do you point that out to them? It makes a difference when the plant manager is the one talking to people.
And leading by example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's what we need in all our leadership and in our companies for sure. So for an organization, um, I imagine, there's a lot of challenges of getting things going and really tracking on all the tasks you've got to do to maintain and manage your system. And I was looking on your website and I thought it was pretty interesting. You had a neat little recommended use of a tool called the monthly management system clock. Let's talk about that, break that down a little bit for the listeners, because it seemed to be pretty interesting for me. That would be like a nice tool to um, help someone walk through and keep up with their obligations.
Well, it's intended to be kind of a high level reminder, just like any improvement program, whether it's fitness goal you're trying to meet or a weight loss. Management systems require regular maintenance.
Some discipline too, right?
Yeah, you need some discipline. If you wait so for example, all the standards require management review. And it's not uncommon for companies to plan a management review later in the year when they've had some time and want to look and see how their progress is going. But in
Uh-huh.
some cases, if you think about it, and certainly in unusual years like this, if you wait till say third quarter or beginning of fourth, it may be too late if you're off track to be able.
Oh, right.
So the clock includes a quarterly management reviews. You don't in management review, you don't have to touch on all topics every management review. You just once a year or whatever frequency you specify, you have to touch on all the required topics. So you could have management review more frequently to look at specific parts of the system that you think either need more attention or you want to celebrate successes. Either way.
So when I look at your clock that you have up on your website, which I thought was pretty good, I liked it. It really kind of gave a good idea, and the animation of the tool was kind of neat that you had posted. So I recommend the listeners to go to uh, a EHSE Management Solutions website and check it out because it's kind of neat. And maybe Audrey, you might be able to give this out to or talk a little more about it later. But so the first quarter of the month was the plan. So January, February, March, you're kind of in that planning phase. Let's unpack this a little bit. Talk about what we're doing in that phase of those first 3 months.
Yeah, so planning, like I said, the bulk of the clauses deal with planning, and it is a big chunk of time. So you don't want to start on the planning in July because you're going to run out of time in the year. So again, first quarter, just some key tasks to make sure that you're on track with the planning clauses. Again, there's a management review, so that would be an opportunity to check that you did complete all those and that the system is off and running as far as working towards your objectives and targets and maintaining your compliance and seeking the improvement, whether it's energy, health and safety, or environment.
So when we're talking about aspects, let's give the listeners a little bit of, deep dive in what's aspects. What is an aspect here? And what's an objective or a target? Let's break this down just a little bit so they can understand what we're talking about.
So aspects are things in your operation. It could be use of water, for example, as an aspect. So, and then the impact is what effect that can have on the environment. So the use of water can be depletion of a natural resource. It could be the wastewater discharge associated with the use of that water. So if the standard requires you evaluate all your aspect impact pairs there and determine which ones are significant. So say you determine that use of water is one of your significant aspects, then you need to put a program in place with an objective and target to improve it. So targets are need to be
realistic.
Yeah, just the acronym: simple, measurable, achievable. Those things. And the standard actually is very specific about what has to be required. The standard actually, with some of the changes they've made over the years, starts to read like a good project management requirement. So there's always, who's going to do it, what is it, how are you going to measure it, what resources are needed, and how do you know when you've reached it? So you're going to put that in place. You're going to have a start time and an end time. And then you'll track against it when you're in the checking phase.
Okay. All right. So that kind of gets us those 3 months of identifying our aspects, setting some objectives and targets for those, and putting them down and committing to them, getting kind of upper management approval. And then toward the end, you're doing a quick little quarterly review just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and you're moving forward, right?
Right.
Now the next 3 months, we've got April, May, and June. That's the do it. You're going to do the work. So let's talk about the things we're doing in this quarter.
Okay, so if we want to stick with our example of water, water use, say your objective and target was to put in fixtures with the auto shut off. So you're going to decide how many of those you need, how many faucets you have to replace. You're going to have how you're going to do that. Is that going to be internally? You'll do the work. Do you hire a contractor? When are you going to do that? And then you'll track against that schedule. So you'll verify that somebody came in, whether it was internal or a contractor, replaced them, and that they're working as they were supposed to, and that as a result, you're using less water.
And then you do another quarterly review toward the end in June there, and just verify that some of the things you implemented are on track.
Correct.
All right. And then we move to the next one is July, August, and September. We're checking. So we're kind of doing some further evaluation, further monitoring of the system. But what else are we looking here?
So here you've got operating controls. So it's a significant aspect you put in operating. You have operating criteria and controls. So those could be maintenance. So that could be that you're checking that the sensors on those auto shutoffs are working properly, and that they're not they haven't malfunctioned. So you set what criteria and how frequently that's going to be checked to verify that you're continuing to get those savings that you expected to get because they are working. There's the evaluation of compliance and the internal audit. So that's of your whole system. Again, it's recommended to get that done before the end of the year so that you have time to act on any findings you might have. Updating the calendar and your objective and target program. Again, that's just tracking. Compliance calendar is your tasks to make sure you're on track with your legal requirements. You're checking that throughout the year.
Okay.
Order management review.
Another review. So yeah, so we're staying engaged with management and just giving them an update on how the process and the system's operating. And you're probably daylighting a few little issues from time to time in each one of these. And the last phase here is the act. So we're going to be October, November, December. It gets us through the year. What are we doing in the act phase here?
This print is really small.
Yeah, so it says here you're planning for the next period and review the plan for the corrective actions from audits.
Right. So there's also, so you're going to review your performance against your objectives and targets. So again, you've been, you did the project, you've been monitoring to make sure that it remains effective, and then you're going to check your results. So again, if we're looking at our water project, you're going to what your water savings were for the year. You're going to communicate the results because all the standards require that you decide who you're going to communicate to when. So this is just a reminder that you need to do that as according to how you set up in your communication plan. Again, a fourth quarter management review to look at the year end, how you did overall, and starting to plan for the next cycle of plan, do, check, act.
Right.
Ready for the next year so that you're starting at the beginning of the year. Again, like I said, you don't want to wait to do your planning steps.
Right.
Or late, you got to do them up front.
And I got to imagine once you get the plan in place, probably the second year is a little easier, or the third year is a little easier because you've kind of really developed kind of that process, procedure, that routine of things, right?
It does get easier. And one nice thing, my experience in the EHSE field is there tends to be sometimes a high level of turnover. So having these systems in places, having the procedures written, somebody can come in new to the job, they can step in and they can see the deadlines, they can see what they're supposed to be working on.
That's a good point right there, because there is a lot of turnover in our industry. And when you lose that institutional knowledge of that person who walks out, it can be hard to replace. And without having some sort of a structure or a manual or a go-to so they can learn, the new person can learn, that's key, especially if you got a complicated, operating, operations that has a lot of regulatory requirements that you're not very familiar with.
And the tendency is a lot of people, when they come in new to a job, they bring all their procedures from their last job because they know them and they liked them and they develop.
Oh yeah, right.
So then you end up, you've got multiple sets of procedures. This way you've got the one, and that doesn't happen.
Sure. Well, so what are the benefits of a company implementing ISO 14001, an EMS program, but that they don't go through the actual certification process? I mean, why would a company do that and not go ahead and get certified?
Well, probably the only main reason you wouldn't get certified was if you don't have anyone requiring you to get the certification.
Okay.
There are a number of reasons why companies get the certification. One, it can be required by a customer. It can be required by a sustainability index or rating system. Could require that you have achieved ISO 14001 or 45001 or the 50001.
Right.
So there might be a number of reasons that external group is requiring you to have it. And so you really need that objective proof that you have achieved the standard, and you need the external register. You can self-declare if you don't have that requirement. You may still want to have somebody from the outside look at your system periodically, because one of the reasons why they're um, included in the internal auditing system is you need objective auditors. And if you're looking at your own system year after year after year, it's harder to
Yeah, you might be a little
tell.
blind spot, right?
Yeah.
So, are there specific industries that require to have a system, in place to do business? And if so, what industries would you are there? Which ones are
It's
there?
becoming more common for different aspects of EHSE or sustainability to be required. The
Hmm.
automotive is probably the most notable requirement.
Automotive industry. Okay,
Initially,
yeah,
the ISO 14001 for all their tier one suppliers,
right.
and they did that early on.
So, just to be a supplier, an OEM supplier, which is original equipment manufacturer, you have to be an ISO 14001 certified firm
Correct.
to even do business with the big three. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what the one topic we haven't really touched on much is auditing. I think a lot of people have fear and trepidation of, oh my goodness, here comes the auditor. They're going to find all my gaps and my failings, so to speak, and people get really nervous about somebody coming to do an audit. Talk about the, what what's involved with auditing a system.
Well, auditing is just a sampling of requirements. And unlike maybe some regulatory audits, it's looking to establish conformance that you are following your system. You're not looking to find that you're not following your system. So
Right, right.
have a little bit of a different orientation from the get-go. One thing that's different about management system auditing versus maybe a regulatory inspection is that the end result isn't necessarily what you're trying to find. You get in and understand how the organization does something because that's part of their procedure. So it's a much more personal audit because you get into how companies do things, not necessarily, okay, here's the report and here's the number on this piece of paper and I've satisfied that requirement. You
Mhm.
need to know how that piece of paper was created and who created it and where the data came from and how it was managed and what the target was that number was intended to show. So they're different than probably what most people think of as a regulatory inspection versus an internal audit or an external audit for a management system.
Okay, so
Requires more interview and more seeing examples of how procedures work rather than just looking maybe at paper and inspections of things. You're looking at how things work and is the system being followed.
So an auditor, it needs to spend a fair amount of time prior to coming to the facility or the location to review what processes and procedures and things like that they have in place, that so they know what to look for when they get there. Or do they just show up and say, show me the standard that you're using and read it and then just go confirm?
Well, some information is needed up front to understand how long and the audit needs to be.
Hmm.
But typically for just a routine, say an internal audit, there isn't a lot of offsite review done in advance.
Hmm.
If you're getting certified for the first time, it's a two-phase audit approach. So that first audit will be mostly paper and could be done offsite, often is done offsite, to
Hmm.
see that the makings are in place, that you actually have the bones of the system there, that there's enough that it's worth to come and do the phase two audit, which is the on-site. Except now in the COVID world, a lot of those are being done virtually
Virtual.
or a combination of um, uh, that the hands-on audit can occur because the basics of the system appear to be there. So there's a two-phase approach for your very first one, but after that, no, there's not a lot of upfront done prior.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, we've covered a lot on this topic here about these various ISO standards, and I gotta imagine the success you hear from clients that have successfully implemented these. I mean, what's the feedback you hear?
I've got to admit, initially, when I was at prior companies and we got the mandates to do this, I was a little bit skeptical and a little bit worried that compliance would get lost, but that wasn't the case. Actually strengthened compliance programs, which was good. And it gave more company commitment to activities that probably wouldn't have happened without having the standard in place. Significant aspects aren't necessarily lined up with regulatory priorities. So you get to work on things that make actual improvements for the environment that may be above and beyond a regulatory requirement. Again, that's why you need the leadership commitment before you even start down the road of doing a management system.
Sure, sure. Well, I hear that you're speaking at the Federation of Environmental Technologists virtual conference coming up. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I and one of my team members here at EHSE Management Solutions are speaking at the FET virtual conference later this month. It's an ISO primer with a focus on how you can integrate and how the standards really are ideal for it now to integrate environmental health and safety and energy into an integrated management system rather than having side-by-side systems going on.
Ah, okay. So you're going to talk about, it's kind of like the integrated contingency plans. You can get your SPCC, your stormwater, your hazardous waste contingency plan, all those in that system. And you're saying you can do the same for all the various ISO systems all into one.
Correct.
Nice. Okay. Well, I bet that's got to streamline the process a bit, and probably pull in more of a commitment from the companies who may have thought about just doing maybe EMS instead of safety. And now they're going to do safety and they say, oh, well, let's throw in energy too while we're at it.
It makes a lot more sense now the way the standards are structured with that high level structure. The clauses are almost identical. They all have the same 10. They're all, but some of the sub clauses may be a little different, but it really, the structure of the standards lend itself much better now to integration than they did before.
Sure, sure. Well, this is good. Well, I mean, the listeners have been hearing a lot about the ISO standard now, and I think they're getting a better feel for what it's about if they haven't, and they need to learn more. How do they get a hold of you to learn more about the ISO management systems?
Either contact me through my LinkedIn page, Audrey Van Dyke, or on the website, which is ehsesolutions.com.
Oh, that's great. Well, Audrey, I think this has been a very enlightening and a good topic to cover because it certainly fits in well with the environmental community. There's so many topics that we've been covering lately, and I'm really glad you came on the show today to talk about the ISO EMS systems and the safety systems and the energy. I mean, there's just been a lot of good coverage here today. And to learn more, they can get a hold of you. And maybe we bring you back on the show down the road, and we'll talk a little bit more about maybe some new specific rule or standard that's being rolled out, and talk about that. That'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be great. Love to.
Well, Audrey, thanks for coming on the show today. Looking forward to getting this out in the podcast. We'll send it out, and you can also get it out to your network, and we'll spread the word about EHSE management solutions. I forget the E. I was always forgetting that, but I apologize for that. But yeah, no, this is good. This was a great interview. Thank you for coming on the show today.
All right. Thanks, John.
All right. Talk to you soon.